And I'd like to introduce and start with our next panel. The panel is for centering justice in Indigenous and place-based methodologies, which we've been talking about with Robin already. The next panel is a series of amazing Native women scholars who many people admire, including myself. Starting with Dr. Deborah McGregor, who's Anishinaabe and is from the Whitefish River First Nations, Birch Island, Ontario. At York University, she was joint faculty with the Osgoode Hall Law and Environmental Studies in Urban Change and is Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Environmental Justice. Professor McGregor's research has focused on Indigenous knowledge systems and the various applications in diverse contexts, including environmental and water governance, environmental justice, health and environment, climate change, and Indigenous legal traditions. She remains actively involved in a variety of Indigenous communities, serving as an advisor and continuing to engage in community-based research and initiatives, and has been at the forefront of Indigenous environmental justice and Indigenous research theory and practice. She's a co-editor of Indigenous Research, Theories, Practices, and Relationships, Indigenous Peoples and Autonomy, Insight for a Global Age, the Anishinaabe Conference Proceeding Series, and Autonomy, Insight for a Global Age. Her current project focuses on environmental injustice, theory and practice, and indigenizing self-determination, so self-determined climate change futures. Her work has been shared in the IEJ project website, which is in your pamphlets here, and in international collaborations on Indigenous research. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Margaret Redsteer, who is an assistant professor at the University of Washington, Bothell, where she teaches climate change adaptation policy, natural hazards, and human disasters and environmental issues. Her research focuses on the linkages of the climatic and earth surface processes related to wind and erosion, sand and dust storms, as well as how climate variability and land use have affected the traditional livelihoods of Indigenous people. And last but definitely not least, Jackie Qataliña Schaeffer, an Inupiaq from Koszybue, I apologize if I mispronounced it, Alaska, is the Community Development Manager at the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium. For decades, she has worked across Alaska holistically, infusing Indigenous knowledge into a variety of sectors she has experience in, including Indigenous knowledge, including comprehensive planning, energy, housing, and water security, and sanitation and climate change adaptation for rural communities. Qataliña received her fashion degree from the American College in London, residential space planning certificate, and studied interior design at Art Institute of Pittsburgh. Qataliña currently sits on the NANA Regional Corporation Board of Directors, Alaska Institute for Climate and Energy Board, Cognac Broadcasting Corporation Board, RCAC Board, Kikatik, oh my goodness, I'm sorry, I'm butchering this word. Tikik, Tagruk, Inupiaq Corporation shareholders, and tribal members of the native village of Koszybue. Qataliña loves her traditional subsistence activities and sharing them with her 6 children and 7 grandchildren, and she currently resides in Palmer, Alaska. With that, I would like to welcome this amazing panel of scholars. Welcome. And again, I'd like to remind people that if you have questions, please use the Slido. So with that, I'd like to invite you beautiful women to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself. I'll start with Deborah.
Okay, yeah, we're all like, who's supposed to go first? Yeah. Thank you for that introduction, and an honor to be on a panel with these amazing women who I'm hoping to know a little bit more in the next hour. And Chimigwech for inviting me and for the opening. And of course, always inspired by Robin's presentations and new insights every time. So always nervous having to go after her because it's like, how do you, I'd look at it as more as building upon what she says. So, so I'm Anishinaabe from Whitefish River First Nation. I'm literally sitting in my community. It happens to be a nice day, which has been unusual over the last couple of weeks. So looking out over at the water, so that's really nice to be able to do that. So in terms of my research, what I'll, because Paulette read, like she conveyed a lot about what I do. So I think one of the best ways to describe it is I've become very interested in what sort of futures that Indigenous peoples wants, particularly at the community level, in terms of how they're negotiating and managing what's coming or what's already here, essentially, climate change and everything that's been that has brought. And this comes from the view that a number of scholars before me, including Robin Kimmerer, Kyle White, and others, have said that Indigenous peoples have already dealt with enormous environmental, social, political, every kind of cultural, spiritual upheaval through colonial processes over centuries. And here we are having these discussions, talking about our experiences and our resilience. And how do you build on that? I mean, that's not to say there aren't like horrifying things happening, because they are. And you know, probably a lot of it will continue, but how do you come out of that and start envisioning a future that includes well-being for future generations and all life? So those are some of the questions that I've become involved in. And a lot of the spaces I find myself in, I confront very different points of view about what that future should look like. And how do you transcend concepts like important ones, mitigation, adaptation, and everything else, to talk about, okay, what does a self-determined climate future look like for Indigenous people as they envision it, not how other people's solutions about what that should be. So I'll stop there because there's a lot more to say, and I'm super keen to hear from others and address the questions that were posed to us, but really happy to be here on this amazing panel and learning and hearing from others. So looking forward to that. So Chimigwech for inviting me.
And I'd like to hand it over to Margaret.
Hello, everybody. I'm Margaret Redsteer, Shodaj. I am talking to you from the land of the coastal Salish, but have worked a lot in southern Montana and in the Southwest. And the topic of rising voices this time was really intriguing to me, because I almost feel like the idea of justice should already be self-evident at this point. We can't go forward and address climate change without equity. Without equity, we cannot address climate change. The two are so closely linked. And I was really struck by Robin's talk this morning. I really appreciate her work. Thank you, Robin, for writing some really beautiful books that have gotten me through some hard times. And your talk today was awesome. So thank you for being here and sharing with us. But I was really struck by the fact that she talked an awful lot about knowledge. And there's a difference between the acquisition of science and the pursuit of knowledge. And so I think that the pursuit of knowledge and what we are really seeking with science is still traditional knowledge if it is based on what we can do to maintain and promote life, right? Isn't that what traditional knowledge is about? whereas conventional science is more about how we can separate ourselves from the natural world. What is heralded in conventional sciences and the way it is used is more about how man can separate himself from the mundane. And that's what gets celebrated. The other issue with conventional science, and then I'll pass it on to Jackie, is that conventional science is about data acquisition. Data and science are not the same. Data and knowledge are not the same. And right now in academia, what is rewarded is the number of papers. It doesn't matter if those papers advance our knowledge in any way, as long as there is data presented and conclusions within the paradigm continued. So those are some of the things that struck me with the discussion that Robin provided to us, and how science can be part of the tool that we use to advance our traditions. Jackie, it's all yours.
Wow, yes. Hello Ripin, Avanga Atiga Qataliña, Kikik Dagrami Nuranga, Inipe Nuranga, Nalogme Jessica Jackie Schaeffer. I am Qataliña. In our language, we are not just a name. We have, in the past, our ancestors only had one name, and it was who you were. And in that meaning, you honored whoever you were named after. And so you were the ancestor that they waited for. And so to me, I like to introduce myself in my native tongue. I am not fluent, I am a learner, and Kikikdagrok is a tough one, because in all our Indigenous languages, we have to retrain our tongue that is trained in English, right? And so I am everything that was just said. I am not a scholar. I am an Indigenous woman, a mother and grandmother, who is an advocate for the future of our people. And with that being said, I love learning. So I won't say I spent 8 years in higher education, of course, studying people. I would say everything about the fashion world and interior design is about people in their space, which was an interesting concept to me, because Indigenous people were migratory. And so we didn't have permanent space. And so this fascination became my study. And so the more I learned about different sectors and how they intersected, and then infused it from a traditional knowledge base perspective, it really is, like everyone has said, that the science world is new. Science is an infant. When we look at our traditional lands, and today I'm on the Deniana traditional lands in Palmer, Alaska, and it's a beautiful day. And I got to walk the river, Grandmother River, yesterday, and came upon a 70-foot driftwood cottonwood tree. And so Grandmother Tree was there to visit and share with me her root system. So I feel really empowered to be on this panel. And, you know, of course, Robin, as an author, it has been a lot of our heroes, right? She is eloquent in her way of phrasing and intertwining words that are in English, but really in an Indigenous context. And to me, that's a beautiful thing. And I am blessed to work and serve our 229 tribes in the state at the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium. So when I work in climate change, I work with communities that are vulnerable, but I also look at the resilience perspective. And if it's okay with you, Paulette, I would like to share a couple documents as we move forward, just for people to share, save for later reference and reading. I really look for Indigenous perspectives in publications, and and how we use our English words to infuse our Indigenous side, right? So that to me is vital, and I'm honored to be here, and I thank you for the invite, and I look forward to this discussion. Diana.
Thank you so much for kind of grounding and centering yourselves within this discussion. It's very appreciated. Now with that, I'd like to open up the Slido and see if there are some questions, and get us a dialogue going between each other and with the community that's here to learn today and exchange knowledge and help each other move forward in this pursuit of understanding ourselves within our world. So with that, let's see, where's the Slido? The first question is, how can Indigenous science centers and projects better support and connect with each other nationally and internationally? And either any of you can chime in.
I think that, you know, I really think that we have a new opportunity in today's day and age to connect. You know, all of our ancestors talked about the stars, and somebody asked about Moon Sister, and I am definitely a moon child born on a new moon, so I'm very connected to that cycle. But how can we better connect? We're doing it right now. And how do we better connect with our, I would say, if we want to collaborate and our partners with universities, is we look at those avenues to be at the table when they're talking about these hard discussions. And we have to understand that they only know what they know. We have a unique vision and a perspective, and our ancestors gave us a way, this platform through the stars, to connect today. But it took a pandemic for us to recognize that. And how many had been left out before, right? How many voices weren't heard because we didn't do this? And so there is opportunity here to do just that. And maybe it is in inviting those Indigenous science centers and even project managers who are boots on the ground to come and be on these panels, to share their personal experience and interaction with vulnerable communities and our Indigenous populations that are maybe a little more isolated to get to. In Canada and in the Arctic, I work a lot across the globe, Greenland, Northern Canada, and Alaska. And there are a lot of similarities because of our logistic challenges. But the only way we're going to share our story is to either bring them to us or for us to go to them. And to me, it comes back to that. Are we ready for the responsibility to share, right? So, yeah, thanks.
I'd like to add to that. I couldn't agree with you more. I think we have to think about sharing our time with others, but we also have to be reaching out and inviting people to come and share their knowledge with us.
Deborah?
Yeah, I think what I would add to that, thank you, Jackie and Margaret, is I think there's there needs to be the space for Indigenous peoples to just provide their own narrative, which they have in international environmental declarations, which I tend to give a lot of respect to, because people came from all over the world from really distinct places and agreed on some things to say at either climate change conferences or environmental or conservation or whatever. So I think about something like the upcoming COP meeting in Scotland and the Indigenous participation there. So that creates a little bit of an opening for that. This year, part of the problem is people can't get there because of how they're coded, whether they're going to get their vaccine stuff in order to be able to access this. And there's been calls for, you know, a separate kind of Indigenous summit. But I agree that we do need to share more broadly, but appropriately. This relates to one of the questions that Robin got, like, how do you share without you know, people appropriating and then taking credit for Indigenous knowledge. I actually see that quite a bit in the climate change literature, because there's a difference between studying the impact of climate change on Indigenous people and their knowledge versus how Indigenous knowledge actually informs all of the things that people care about in climate science, what like adaptation, mitigation, monitoring, and all of that, right? So to me, so some of this work is already occurring. Like right now, I'm collaborating with a Sami scholar. And the way that we're approaching this, because a question that's always going to come from a reviewer, and again, these were some of the questions that Robin got, is like, why? Who cares? Like, why are we doing this comparative work? Why should we be looking at Anishinaabe and the Great Lakes and Dene and Caribou and Sami and reindeer herding? Like, what is that? Like, what's the commonality here? So there's a number of commonalities, and one of them is our collective history of colonization and capitalism and all of that, and the impact on communities and how these are related to food security. So there's actually very common things on the ground, even though they were very diverse. But then we still have to have like the big question, right? Like you have to have, people want a question that you're going to answer. And I think, again, what we want is, well, what our future want to look like? So then that's where you kind of go international and global and try to figure out, okay, what is Indigenous knowledge, or what can Indigenous climate leadership, how might they approach this question? So one of the examples that comes to mind, like I'm currently trying to wrap my head around, it'd be great to hear other people's perspectives on this, including Robin, because it's kind of like, I see it as sort of her area, is this whole push on the Convention on Biodiversity for living with nature, or living in harmony with nature by 2050. Like, one, I kind of think that's too late. And secondly, people already did that for a long time. Why don't you ask them? And part of it is, and then the nature-based solutions, this whole big thing on nature-based solutions, right? And I'm thinking, well, Indigenous people have already kind of done that. Like, why, like, it's a big kind of global international push the UN has adopted, and nation states are trying to figure this out. But I still find Indigenous voice and perspective and experience very marginalized in those discussions. And I'll stop now, because obviously I'm about to go nuts there, because this is something I'm thinking about a lot as we're trying to work through this. Is there's these underlying assumptions in that. And one of them is the separation between people and nature. Like, the underlying assumptions in a lot of those initiatives is that it's not an Indigenous perspective. So everyone thinks Indigenous people can do this. I'm like, actually, we come from it from a different point of view. And it doesn't mean there isn't opportunities for collaboration and informing, because I look at those and I'm like, okay, we already did that. Like, and then the question becomes, how do you then share that at these different scales in ways that make sense, that move towards solutions and problem solving? So I'll stop there, because obviously I'm getting out of hand, a little excited about that topic. But.
Well, before I go too much further, I did kind of jump ahead and not give you each the opportunity to really discuss, you know, how your perception and experience with centering justice in Indigenous and place-based methodologies. You know, I don't want to take away from what you might have wanted to discuss, kind of by jumping to the questions a little too quick. I'm so excited. I'm so starstruck by you guys. It's silly. So if you each have a little to talk about, you know, this Indigenous methodologies and place-based, you know, centering justice in our methodologies, you know, please let's take a moment to reflect on that. And I'd like to start with Margaret this time.
Well, I think I haven't really focused as much on methodology as just community knowledge. And I came from it from the viewpoint of somebody who lived on the reservation, didn't have access to water, got removed forcibly by the federal government, ended up going to school because it was the only way to support my family, and find out, wow, climate change is going to be a big problem. And if I go back to the community where I was living, We have no weather stations. We have no record of what change is going on, but we all know the changes are underway. So how do we document that? How do we document the fact that our home is drier and hotter than the surrounding communities that we go to on the weekends and we go to when we can't handle the climatic conditions that we are dealt with because of the reservation boundaries? And so that's sort of the perspective I came from. I never thought about Indigenous methodologies per se. It was all born of necessity of just communicating what is happening to the people where I came from and how climate plays a major role in that. So, I mean, that's sort of my perspective. So it's a little bit different than other people who have had a chance to actually think about where the methodology comes from. But in doing that, you know, like I was very cognizant of the knowledge holders where I live, where I was working, and how that knowledge was tied back to their connection to the land and to the natural systems there. Where did they go to get medicinal plants? Where did they go to get dyes for baskets and for weaving? Those kinds of things. So what kind of historical changes did they see? What are the plants that they need for different ceremonies and things like that? And how had they changed? Because if you tie it back to that, then you're tying it back to place, you're tying it back to specific geography, and it has a lot of meaning, and people remember and know how their ability to survive has changed because it is tied to living. So I guess my methodology is more about living and how do we move the conversation forward and promote living conditions for communities. I mean, this afternoon, I have to give a lecture to a bunch of young people, college students, in a climate change adaptation class. And I have to make sure they understand very clearly that no matter what we do to mitigate greenhouse gases right now, the climate impacts are here. And right now, we have a negotiation going on in Congress where they can't even decide to include climate change in legislation because it might cost something to them. And so to me, it's about people and about promoting life and vitality of life, not just resilience.
Thank you. Deborah, Jackie?
Jackie gave me the nod, so I'll thank you. Yeah, that was amazing. I think for me, and when I'm in what I call the climate policy circles, that I go through the National Indigenous Organization in Canada, and through this other kind of think tanky kind of thing called Climate Choices in the Canadian context. I find that the economists and the scientists don't like to have discussions around justice. They still like, so there's a difference between naming something climate crisis, climate emergency. So there's a whole dialogue and terminology that kind of works in certain spaces, like Indigenous climate justice, like why are we talking about justice? So I find like even the kind of conversations that we have, the dialogue and the terminology that we use really matters. So when I show up and say, like your idea of what the solution is actually going to cause injustice in Indigenous communities. They have a hard time wrapping their head around that. They don't get why electric cars might solve a problem in Toronto, but doesn't solve a problem in Pewanik, which is a flying community of only 100 people and dirt roads. Like they don't get how, you know, what, how they're defining the problem. And you could do this because I did this. I sent a student out, get me the IPCC definition of climate change. And I don't hear that when I'm in communities and they're talking about climate change. They have different assumptions about and ideas about what that is. And it doesn't mean the scientific definition out of IPCC is wrong. It's just limited. It doesn't capture the whole experience of Indigenous people and what's just and unjust there. So people don't like that. They don't like justice being raised or equity or emergency. Indigenous nations pass resolutions about climate emergencies in their communities or climate crisis. They don't talk about it that way. Even so, I'm sitting in the room going, but they don't like the other C words too. So they don't like colonialism because that's a big issue for how people can mitigate, adapt, how they understand what they can do, how to be resilient, how to be vibrant. I like that. Vitality, I like that too. We just don't want to survive. We want to be like flourishing people and nations, right? So I don't like that either. They don't like it when you say, okay, you really need to decolonize how you're thinking because you're not letting go of some things and you keep thinking just thinking the status quo is going to get us somewhere sustainable, and it's not. Like pretty well, I think every disaster report, that I call them disaster reports that come out, like the recent IPCC report, the IPBS report on disappearing species, like none of that's good news. And so they call for a transformation, and just tweaking the status quo, business as usual, isn't going to get us there. So they don't like discussions around gender in relation to these either. They're like, I don't know what that has to do with anything. I'm like, seriously? Like, so I always feel like I'm in this uphill battle about introducing language that's going above people's heads. And then I have to explain, like, what do I mean by these? Like, why are they relevant? Like, people saying, I don't understand how colonialism is relevant for climate, because you call it climate change and not climate justice. So you're not getting it. So so I'm in these spaces educating all the time. Like, it's easier to teach the college students than it is to be in a lot of these spaces. They don't like those words, patriarchy, capitalism. If you call that into question, like green capitalism or natural capital, like let's make nature capital and figure out if we kill the caribou here, if that's more expensive than over here, like those are kind of like weird conversations that are going on. So I think, so I see that very much as like really changing the dialogue, having like an honest dialogue and calling it what it is and how it impacts people is really important. And then the work I do to answer to methodologies and place-based is, the approach that I'm taking is place-based in the sense of, again, linking like something that's like the moon, like project I have right now working with youth is working with the moon and the phases of the moon and what's happening during each moon, like each full moon, what should be happening then. And there's a lot of science that obviously is happening, like this is when fish should be spawning and this should be happening. And if that's not happening at that moon, then we know there's a problem. And this is in the lived memory and history of Indigenous people. Doesn't matter where you are on the planet. We're looking at, people tend to have some kind of relationship with the moon. So again, it relies on these kind of relationships. And so I have youth working on that. And every full moon, it's like using your senses. Like you can be a scientist and observe what's going on around you. And it could be different. Right now I'm in my community, but I usually work in Toronto. That's where my university is. So even the full moon, so I have to come up here because you want to go to the same place in order to notice. It's about 3 weeks difference. Like my tomatoes are already like all ripe in Toronto. Up here, they're still green. Like they're not, so you planted them totally the wrong time if you don't know the place. So we're trying to like embed the place-based component to it, and then relationships and embody those kind of relationships that we have with the natural world and our relatives, like the moon. So we had our own knowledge around that can work also with science as well. So so again, that was probably too long-winded, but I wanted to comment on the kind of spaces I'm in, and people don't want to go certain places with language and the dialogue that we have because they don't want to acknowledge justice. And because if you acknowledge justice, then you have to kind of acknowledge there's injustice. And it's different for people. And then how do you incorporate like place-based and Indigenous methodologies and really trying to empower youth, that these people that we're counting on for the solution kind of have failed us really. And so we really need sort of more ground depth or different kind of approaches anyway that need to be brought into the conversation. So thank you for bearing with me on that little rant there.
Thank you very much, Deborah. Jackie?
Wow. So yes, to all of that. And it is, how do you talk about climate justice when you live in a place and work with communities that are seeing it 7 times faster than anywhere else on the planet, yet they don't even have basic water and sanitation. So you're not at even the standard of human health, and you're dealing with all of that. There are a lot of health indicators, and this is where my curiosity has kind of taken me. There's so many things when we're, I appreciate Robin saying it's okay to grieve, because it is. And emotions, and I mean, when you're dealing with, say, an example would be a community that has been threatened by climate change impacts, that has seen hundreds of feet erode into a tidal influenced river. And when you sit with the elders, their dreams are of their grandchildren being washed out in their sleep. And you're trying to find solutions to bring them to safe ground, but the federal government needs them to hire an attorney to negotiate a land exchange because it's a reserve where they want to move. And then in that process, even though it's all federal government funded, they lose out. The government gets 3 times the amount of land in the exchange as this tiny village. And then the process itself. So our American processes in government are through a colonized lens. And yes, that is a word that people don't want to hear, but we have to acknowledge it in order to create different outcomes. If we can't even acknowledge it in conversation, policy will never change. And it doesn't matter how many Indigenous people we have in a particular place, it's not going to make the impact that's going to ripple into the future. So when of course, I'm very specific to Alaska. So climate change, Indigenous knowledge, and modern science, we have, 229 tribes. We have 11 distinct cultures and 20 languages, hundreds of dialects, and we have 12 regions that were sliced up during Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act on over 400 million acres of land. But of that, we have 144 environmentally threatened communities. So 43% of all our communities in the state of Alaska are threatened by climate change. And most of those communities were placed in areas that are very fragile, and they were used for summer camps. And so they only came during a seasonal migration. And then the government came with churches and schools and said, you have to stay here. But it was wherever they could land, right? So it was in the summer. And now we're talking about the Arctic. So in another community, it could be in the summer, the temperatures are 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And in the winter, they're -70 Fahrenheit. So you also have the engineering feat of temperature variance. You might as well engineer for the moon, but make it affordable for Earth. So the challenges become almost overwhelming. And when you're a small tribe with a leader who is wearing multiple hats, if you don't have a support network, if you don't have an Indigenous mindset, it becomes very difficult to maneuver in that arena. And I say that because Indigenous mindset is community first, family second, self kind of third. In a Western setting, a capitalist setting, it's me, self first, family second, and maybe community if you have time because you're so busy focusing on self. And so we have to recognize that there's opposites here. And opposites can coexist if you understand them both, because you're maneuvering in between that space. But it also provides space for opportunity to create new spaces for the future. So if we're gonna look at climate change in Alaska, I'm not gonna just look at the science perspective, because it's doom and gloom for us and it's happening fast. But if I look through an Indigenous lens and I speak to elders, they remind me that our people have gone through multiple changes and we've survived in the same geographic area for 17,000 years. Science is under 150 years, baby. So we have to recognize that and not get stuck. So I like to, when I do visioning sessions with tribal leaders to help them see their future, I use that 17,000 years. And then I say, okay, let's put 150 years of colonization in here. It's a sliver in time. Let's not get stuck up on that sliver in time. Let's step back like our ancestors would and truly assess what we're dealing with, so that not only can we infiltrate, but we can maneuver with a mindset that is based on all of us, because every decision we make is going to ripple around the planet. So are we ready for that responsibility, right? And that responsibility in a Western context is scary. They make it scary. Everything is fear-based. But in an Indigenous context, it's as, I mean, recently, there is an exhibit in Geneva right now, and dear friends of mine are part of it, and they tell the story. There's 4 Tsimshian masks, and they tell the story of the salmon people. And that story alone, I mean, like, by the time I got to Grandmother River, I was bawling. So it's like reading, when you recognize that knowledge, and I think, Deborah, you said it, our oral history has been disregarded by colonists forever, but our oral history is 17,000 years or more, continuous. And just because it wasn't written down doesn't make it not valuable. And right now, we are in a critical, pivotal point in time where that Indigenous knowledge is going to be the solution base for the future. And so we have to have these gatherings and have these hard discussions and recognize that, all things, if we're going to create.
Oh no, you froze up, Jackie.
Quality, we have to look at it through a.
Yeah. Jackie, you froze up.
Because it's broader than that. Okay, my rant was long, sorry. Okay, I thought I was ranting too long. I'm gonna try this. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, I'm done. And I'm just so blessed to hear all this, because there is an interconnectivity here that is just beautiful. And I hope we all just simply acknowledge and recognize that. So thank you.
Thank you. We have a little more time let's get to some of these other questions here. Can you pull up the Slido for me, please? How can we push land-based universities to honor Indigenous communities or give repatriations, and how would this work? Any input from you amazing women?
I think there will be a lot of difficulty with that, simply because we need to acknowledge all of the tribes and Indigenous people that have been in a particular region. And so when there are recognized and unrecognized tribes from a region, just having a university recognize a particular tribe or a particular group can be politically contentious. So until we can resolve some of the ways that that tribes have to exert their sovereignty, it's going to remain a difficult question.
I'll chime in, even though I'm not as familiar with this in the Canadian context, but I guess one thing that universities are trying to do, and this more has to do with, Truth and Reconciliation Commission and recommendations there, although some were doing this before, is recognizing that they are on Indigenous territories and figuring out who those communities are and trying to come to some relationship building and agreements in the sense of MOUs and going, okay, how can this university serve priorities, community needs, research of the communities around? York is just starting this, actually, literally in an email a couple of weeks ago. Who are the communities? How can we start serving their needs? But still, there's sort of some inequity in that because universities are way more funded than any Indigenous community. So even like in Indigenous research or research involving Indigenous people, you need to be able to support the capacity in the community to engage with the institution. They just assume they're going to maybe get a list or a table of some questions, maybe that the community wants to engage in, but then somebody still needs to be there in the community with the capacity to be able to engage with all the researchers and graduate students and ethics protocols and everything else that's going to be put on them, right? So it's not, anyway, there's a lot of capacity that needs to be recognized. And I think probably, like for me, one thing that I advocate for is that Indigenous peoples just aren't, objects to be studied or subjects to be studied, like participants or populations. That Indigenous peoples were complete societies and had everything that any society would have, however disrupted through colonialism and capitalism and imperialism and all those isms that happened, and that they need to be recognized as such. So people have their own knowledge, have their own ethics, have their own questions that need to be respected. So those kind of relationships are still being, I think, negotiated. And as said before, they're complicated. And sadly, I worked in government for 10 years for Environment Canada, and and then being in the university context for like 20 years. And I find, strangely enough, government's more responsive because they're public. So universities are publicly funded too, but they kind of like to be hands off, right? Because that's the academic freedom and being objective and everything else. So it's really hard for communities to get really upset like they can with government and send letters in and have advocacy and everything else, right? And get a change in something, whatever that might be. Very difficult to do that in universities because they're like, well, we don't need to respond to you because we're academic and you're challenging our academic freedom with your silly questions as opposed to ours, So I actually find it harder institutionally to get things done, even though me as a researcher can carry that weight and do interesting things in my research. The institution itself doesn't often want to go there. So I find it hard for communities to have inroads to be able to kind of get what they want or what they need, unless they're part of university governance they're sitting on governing or something like that. So that's probably more specific to the Canadian context that I can speak to. So sorry, I couldn't answer that question in the way that I think someone would have wanted me to. So just tried my best at that.
No, thank you so much. I mean, having these diverse responses is just as important as any of it, because there's not a one size fits all, right? And it's going to vary from place to place and from institution to institution. So I appreciate all three of your suggestions and input and comments. So the next question is, how do we address that Indigenous knowledges have agency? Because knowledge from my lens is that knowledge is our elders, elders plural. How do we address that Indigenous knowledges have agency?
I don't know if I can answer that fully, but I totally agree that our Indigenous knowledge is our elders. They are our keepers. They're our libraries of our oral history and our traditional practices. So I personally look at it as I'm learning, because I learn every day, be it in an Indigenous context or a Western academia context, because I'm working with some amazing research teams. And so I learn from them every day. But I recognize that my traditional value system and that Indigenous knowledge is the base of who I am. All that other academia are simply tools for me to maneuver in the current societal structure we have. And so, and I think that, you know, we have to step up and create that space. You know, for a while, I was very uncomfortable being in an academia setting because I'm with a bunch of scholars, and I always considered myself in my mind as a mother and a grandmother. And so, and it's funny, I had to recondition my mindset. So again, it goes back to, I remember my father saying, if we encourage and send all our kids out of state to go to university and they come back with a Western mindset, they're useless to us because they'll never understand how to apply it to our world. And it makes sense to me now. But it took me over 50 years to truly understand that. And so I think that there again, like you said, Paulette, there's no one way to look at it. There are multiple ways to look at it. And really stepping in and stepping up and carrying that responsibility and being comfortable in that you are the warrior for your people to share their story and their knowledge, and then find that new space and protect it like it's sacred, because it is. And then it becomes a whole different avenue for you to maneuver in. And yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Deborah, do you have any input?
Yeah, it was just, it's an interesting question in terms of how it's phrased, because it's my understanding, the more I learn about, and you know, I've sort of hit the wall in terms of kind of what I learned from reading at this point. It's like really kind of in communities, people who think in the language and who are there, who I learn a lot from at this point in time, and from panels like this, like from other people basically. And Indigenous knowledge is like also having its own agency means it exists outside of people as well. Like it's embedded within people, but it's also embedded within the land, and the land also contains and conveys knowledge, and can decide whether it's going to be shared or not. So this is like what folks would call the reveal knowledge, like either in dreams or ceremony, or like we're asking for it. So it kind of exists as out people. Academic world has a hard time with that because through universities or other places, governments and institutes and NGOs, we generate and produce knowledge, but it also exists outside of people. And that's consistent kind of with our worldview. We're not the be all end all. Nature also has its own agency. So when I read the question, that's what I'm thinking. And this builds a little bit on what Robin talked about, is that we have to be ready. So sometimes it's there in our face, like climate change was there in people's faces, and Indigenous people, because we still have that skill set to be able to listen to what's going on with the earth, we're far clued into that before other people. And so it could be there, but we don't have the capacity to be able to understand what's going on, to recognize that not like the land and other entities are trying to share knowledge with us, but we're too busy reading or on our phones or whatever else, or as Jackie said, we're not in the right mindset to kind of get that message. There was one at this youth elders gathering that I facilitated a few years ago. There was a young woman from Northern Ontario. And the way that she described climate change is the earth is trying to tell us what's happening to her. And it's our capacity to be able to listen and act on that knowledge that the earth is trying to convey. Other people are calling it natural disasters and other things, but really it's the things are happening to the earth and it's trying to communicate with us. So that's how I think about that question is, for sure, a lot of knowledge is within people and it's relational, and that's kind of how I learn a lot of it, because I'm not that great at learning from the land itself these days. So that's what I would chime in on. And that's kind of what I hear from a community perspective. Probably harder to convey that and then in like the peer-reviewed literature, which I, having reviewed a lot of it in relation to climate change, I don't see that there. very often. So that's all I can really kind of add to that, if that kind of works for people or not, that kind of understanding that I think I'm just tip of the iceberg. I don't think I remotely kind of did credit to how people talk about this. But that's kind of where I'm going in terms of with knowledge as well. Like literally it comes from these other places that's beyond the human dimension, and how good are we at understanding that and grasping that and perceiving it.
Margaret, would you like to chime in, or should we move on to the next question?
I think connecting to the land actually does teach you a lot. And I think Indigenous knowledge does have agency, and in the long run, it's going to be very clear that it does. Frankly, the more scientific advancements in ecosystem service, ecosystem connections to the hydrosphere, to the lithosphere, to the atmosphere. I mean, the more that science begins to look at all the interconnected systems that support life on Earth, the more it just reinforces the fact that the Indigenous knowledge worldview has had since I've known. So, you know, the Gaia hypothesis didn't start with James Lovelock. Let's put it that way.
Right. I love how Margaret just goes, when science catches up, then we'll be good. Excellent. So I'll go ahead and I'll move on to this next question. How can a non-Indigenous person create a respectful, Indigenous-led and centered SEK-TEK convergent science program within their institution with the goals of this workshop, but on a smaller scale, prioritizing decolonization and anti-racism without the emotional burden falling on Indigenous leaders? Margaret, would you like to start out with that?
Sure, I think it's absolutely possible. Although the pandemic has been terrible, in some ways it has actually opened people's eyes to a number of things. One of them is the fact that our societies need to think more holistically about our communities and our children and our health and how they're all connected. And it's also forced people to spend time outside. And here in Seattle, our students are eating lunch outside, even in the rain, and spend time outside, and the teachers spend time outside talking to the parents outside while the children are playing in the dirt. And I think that that's a really great beginning to where this could go. And in fact, it will help to promote learning in a way that is more meaningful for our children.
Jackie?
Yeah, I totally agree. You know, in Alaska, our communities are logistically challenged in the sense that you have to fly. And so what happened when the pandemic hit was those flights were minimized. Communities were cut off. But what happened was beautiful. I also am part of a revitalization of our Indigenous medicine and plants as food. And it was beautiful to see the knowledge-based sharing of our Indigenous plants and our return of the language. So, you know, science shows that in communities, small communities where suicide rates are high and alcohol and addiction are high, the return of a language, 50% in that population, the suicide goes to zero. And so part of that revitalization is understanding. So if you're a non-Indigenous person and you're trying to learn, you first have to listen. And listening is not taught in English setting. only you learn to speak and you learn to present, and listening is not part of the lesson. In the Indigenous community, the first thing a child learns is to respect and be quiet. And so you have to recognize that these opposites can coexist, but you have to teach each other them, right? And first you have to acknowledge it. I have I'm in arenas just like you, Deborah, where they don't even want to hear the word colonization, because why are you so hung up on that? I'm not hung up on it. Our people were the last colonized people on the planet. I'm just talking, like, my grandparents were that contact. So, we have to understand the perspective in which the people we are communicating with are coming from. And I really believe it can exist. And we're at a time in human society where we are embracing things we haven't embraced before. And I really think it's a beautiful shift.
Deborah?
Yeah, what I'll add to that, just in relation to Jackie's comment where people don't think colonialism is relevant, I'm kind of living it every day. Like, what do you mean it's not relevant? Like, it's just, it doesn't matter what space I'm in, it seems to be in my face. So I guess to answer that question, I think there's different approaches to this. I think that one that some that I'm involved in is the creation of these ideas around what they're calling ethical space, and ethical space around different knowledge systems, because it's not even just science and Indigenous knowledge. There's like multiple knowledges out there that need to be recognized and embraced, and actually the concepts where you can recognize difference and their strengths and weaknesses and what they could bring to a problem or to a challenge. A lot of it comes from Indigenous thinking. So in Canada, people really like the two-eyed seeing approach. This idea of ethical space that comes from Korean and Willie Ermine, where you're trying to create a space where people can have these it's safe space where people can have these conversations. So I'm actually part of a project that looks at that. What are those principles? What does that look like? Because it's going to change depending on the nations. Is what's going to work in Anishinaabe, let's say conservation context, is going to be different in fisheries on the coastal, right? Because the people have so these are like already Indigenous people already had this kind of thinking and models. If you start again from the premise that we were a complete society, so we are interacting with each other as societies and nations, we already had to do that. So we already have these ways of doing that. So I think there's movement along that, but decolonization still needs to be part of that conversation, in the sense that people who have positions of power, and scientists still do. I was just reading a report how that's who mostly gets funded for climate change research, this report that I was just reading this morning. And you have to let go of some things. It just can't be Indigenous people as an add-on. It just can't be Indigenous people being brought into this other process and then hope for the best. There has to be decolonization. People have to just go, I kind of have to be open and let go of some ideas in order for other ones to make it in here. So there's these ideas around ethical space, and really a lot of people are drawing on Robin Kimmerer's work for this, like the idea of braiding, so you're not integrating and jamming different knowledge systems and mushing it all up and hoping for the best, or weaving knowledge systems. So there's these different paradigms that are coming out of that, this really creative thinking. And it also comes from nature. Like, these ideas are literally coming from the land and from nature itself for how to do this. So I agree, you need to get people outside and starting to use their senses, because we're very text-based, and that's a very limited way of kind of using your brain or your body, actually, our potential, our humanity. So yeah, lots to say there, but I will say that it's a thing, and people are really trying to figure this out, because they know. Because really, again, if you recognize Indigenous people as complete societies and nations, we want science too, because we want to govern. We want to make the best decisions that we can make for ourselves and communities and future generations. So there's a place for knowledge sharing and all of this. So hopefully that somewhat answered that question. It's a good question. I really appreciated the other panelists' responses as well, and completely agree.
And on that, I want to thank you all for such deep and honest and real articulations of your understanding, your experience, and your expertise, especially. We've run out of time for this panel, and I'm sad because it's been amazing. And there are so many other questions and comments that people have been chiming in on both the chat and in the Slido to, talking to each other and conversing, their thoughts and ideas. And I want to thank you all so much for being here. And I look forward to the days I get to hang out with you all in person. I got to present with Deborah McGregor in Washington, D.C. once, and it was an amazing experience because I've been reading her work, and to actually get to meet your sheroes is always amazing for me. And so thank you so much. And I'd like to encourage everybody to take another 15-minute break, or we'll be back at 1:45. And then we'll come back and do the working group breakout sessions and discuss and explore why it's important and how to center justice in intercultural collaborations that engage Indigenous and place-based methodologies. So thank you so much for your time and applause. And I look forward to speaking with you again soon. So thank you so much. Yahweh.